is like, why should I respond to this? And I think in some ways, you know, the work that we're trying to do is tell communities that in some they need to be undaunted, right? That they need to that their voices, and we need to find a place for their voices to be lifted up in ways that allow for them to address the change that they want to see. And I think the census is just one of those places where we struggle, community struggles, because the promise is often not delivered. And I think partly what we want to lift up in our work on the Black Dispatch is what is that promise, but also now let's talk about how we can deliver it.
We had conversations with people who checked us on that. 10 years ago, you asked us to fill out the census and resources would come. 20 years ago, the same thing, promises not kept.
Right.
Yeah.
Right.
So as we talk about, you know, how we kind of construct, you know, the both the show and the podcast, let's talk about, you know, let's say something about who Kirk is.
Yeah.
I'll do the same.
Well, that may be a little dangerous, but so cut.
Should I grab you there?
Yeah.
So
I think it's a delivery.
Yeah.
How you doing?
Good, how are you?
There you go. Still here.
Thank you.
All right. Have a good day.
You too. Oh, I didn't say that.
Sorry about that, folks. These unexpected things, right?
Right. So we can go back to wherever you want to go.
Okay.
I think you did an introduction. Let's talk about who Kirk is.
Yeah. That's where we left off.
Yeah. All right. You can go in Army now.
So
No. You speeding?
I'm set here now.
Okay. All right. Go.
yeah. So I said that's a little dangerous because I mean, so I am. I'm a guy who grew up in the '60s, and that really defines the way in which I look at the world. And I remember as a 10-year-old being kind of caught in the urban unrest of North New Jersey, and in many ways, that experience, and I never realized this, but that experience has really contoured my entire personal and professional journey. Because the question that I've always asked myself as a function of that experience is that why do we have these different realities for different groups of individuals in our country? And as a lawyer, which is why I became a lawyer, that reality drove me. But also I recognize that even in the constraints of being a lawyer and the practice of law, that systems are essentially rigged, and what lawyers do is work within the constraints of those rigged systems. And I always believe that we have to transform those systems, which is what got me into planning. Because my belief is that if we can begin to understand the systems that are generating these things, whether it's zoning or problems with segregation or unequal distribution of resources, divestment, disinvestment. If we can get to those questions, we can remove some of the constraints that mitigate the success of our communities. And our communities are amazingly resilient, and that's the other thing that we always have to remember, otherwise they wouldn't have survived so long under the American circumstance. So I guess who I am as an individual that always wants to call the question of why hasn't change occurred to the extent that it should have, which is the call, I think, that many of these movements that we're seeing across the country, Black Lives Matter, and all these movements that are saying, why haven't we changed more than we are? Why are we still experiencing these same dilemmas in an alleged American democracy? So I guess who I am is I'm a person who's committed to kind of seeing our communities transform, recognizing the resiliency of those communities, and love, and my man Cornel West always says, what does love look like in public? Justice. And that's what I think, that I'm seeking.
So my pathway to this spot is very different than yours. Born, raised on the most beautiful island there is, Jamaica. So I gotta give a shout out to the island of Jamaica. But nonetheless, I grew up in a family, in a household where we have continuously lived in that home. My mother, 94 years old, lives there now and is 112 years standing. We had a sense of privilege. Went to a private school, my mother was a teacher, everyone in my family were teachers. And I came to this country, and because of the color of my skin, all that privilege got left on the island. Walking down the street, I was just like my brothers and sisters, a person of color. So it was very interesting growing up here, in my adult years, to be able to be a part of the community and be functioning as a professional to strengthen the community. So I've done urban planning my entire life, and there was a time when we planned in ways that didn't impact my community enough. I'm at a stage in my life now where strengthening my community is my only resolve. And I feel strongly, and I know you do too, we have a set of values and a set of principles where how we work either professionally or in terms of supporting the community, it's all about having a positive impact.
Absolutely. No, I think that's right. And, I think, just thinking about the work that we've done together and how that manifests, our Black Men and Boys Project, for example, is calling the question on what we think we understand about the circumstance and plight of Black men and boys in the Chicago area and region. And not only Black men and boys, but the implication that has for Black women and girls, because we know that community is manifest as a function of how the health of those relationships, the health of those individuals in the context of the systems that they have to function in, and the level at which those systems stress them or don't provide them with what they need, then translates into poor outcomes into our communities and our children. And so, one of the challenges is that we know also from those experiences that communities are willing to pick up their responsibilities, but those responsibilities that they pick up have to be augmented by the responsibilities of others who have control over so many of the resources that impact our communities, whether it's economic development, jobs, employment, transportation, housing, etc.
Yeah. So just for the sake of viewers and people who are listening, when we talk about this project for Black men and Black boys, over the course of 4 or 5 years, we had probably over 80 discussions with men, young men, women, about the challenges they face when they get up in the morning.
That's right.
And they were pretty explicit in terms of being able to share with us some of the strengths that they have as men, as fathers, as young men and young women, but some of the challenges that they face. And as planners, I think it gives us a unique perspective in terms of when we ask them to strengthen their families, strengthen the home in which they live, and the block, neighborhood, the community in which we serve, they were willing to stand up and say, this is what we feel and how we can contribute
That's right.
to that. We also asked the question though, the responsibility of City Hall, in this case Chicago, and we did some work in the city of Gary, in terms of what happens in Springfield, what happens at the federal level. So these systems that people felt were there to be able to be supportive of them and their families, which we know are tattered.
Right. Well, look, as you know, I'm a policy guy. So one of the things that really get me up in the morning is understanding the way in which systems function or don't function within our communities. And we as planners, I think, are always calling, or should be always, we don't always, unfortunately, but should be always calling the question is what are the relative benefits and burdens of these systems and how do they manifest in our communities? And too often they manifest in very negative ways. And so I think one of the things that we want to do in this Black Dispatch is lift up a systems thinking analytical approach, because we can talk all day about what individuals do, and that's important, and we should never remove the idea of individual agency or the responsibility that we as individuals and community members have to our community. But we also have to equally hold to account civic leaders, corporate leaders, governmental leaders to the responsibilities and the controls that they have over the flow of resources, over the decisions about investment, and the mechanisms by which we continue to replicate the disadvantage, which often goes unquestioned and undeterred. So I think that's what as planners, progressive planners, I think that's part of what our responsibility is to lift up and have a much more systemic view and engage the conversation communities in that, because systems seem big, but systems are really about a collection of various actors and actions that come together to produce an outcome. And we need to be able to understand both at the macro and the micro level what those interventions might be to change the course of the way those systems have historically functioned.
We talk about systems, and you can have casual conversations with people who are walking on the street, and they will tell you in a minute, man, the system is just not working for us. What does that really mean? I mean, for me, this last year in 2020, when we talk about the systems that were already broken for so many of the communities, access to healthcare. In a pandemic, how do people not have access to healthcare? In a pandemic, the system that provides you with excellence in education, but we had to go virtual, but we don't have the resources to be able to do that. In terms of people who were on the forefront of getting jobs, how do you get to jobs in a pandemic? So access to efficient transportation. So these systems that are in place that were not in place for too often Black and brown communities, how do we come out of this pandemic knowing that systems that did not work well then, what do we do moving forward?
Well, so and this is something that, and I did this this video, which was, as you know, as planners, we often interface with institutional actors that themselves are serving planners. And I happen to serve on a committee that was focused on social justice and urban planning with the national APA. And they did a really nice job on a little presentation or discussion that I precipitated around equity. And one of the things that I think is really important about kind of what we mean when we say equity, and I say that, point to the audience because, we have there's different interpretations of what equity is. But what I can tell you, before, not going down in that direction too much, to say equity really does not happen by accident. That is, if you're going to generate an outcome, that you have to be purposeful, intentional, and you have to understand how resources flow in order to produce that outcome. And I think too often we talk the rhetoric of equity, but we don't play the game of equity. And that's where I think I want us to be having conversations about what does that game look like if it's a game in equity, and what does it look like if it's not happening by accident.
I think that this platform, you know, allows us to be able to have the type of discussions, engage our community in ways to advance how we feel that we should strengthen, you know, our communities. I think the Black Dispatch can serve that purpose. I was in the barbershop this morning getting ready for the show, and the conversation that I was having with my barber, I think he is anticipating us coming in as asking some questions around, you know, how do we advance his voice.
Yeah. Well, I think that's the ultimate objective of the Black Dispatch, is to lift up what actions look like. And you know, often when we talk about creating equity, creating justice, creating and informing democracy, it's both little steps and big steps. And I think what we want to do in the Black Dispatch is talk about both of those. And because the collective action of community is critical, and the ways in which we challenge those stakeholders who have controls over the apparatus of various systems that impact our community also have to be held accountable. So we have to be working at multiple dimensions, and we have to be facilitating a conversation at multiple dimensions. So, you know, that's one of the things I'm really excited about in terms of our practice and action-oriented approach that we want to lift up, is the kind of guests that we might have. And I know you and I have been kind of both dreaming and brainstorming on the guest piece, and I know you have some thoughts about what that might look like.
Oh, I think that we have some exciting guests, but I'm not going to share that yet.
Oh, okay. Oh, yeah. We hold that back, brother. That makes them come back.
But we will have guests that the community will recognize, guests that the community will respect because of the impact that they have, the trust that the community residents have placed in the guests that we have. And these guests are guests that I think that will have something to share. We will also have guests who we will hold accountable because they are either the business leaders, civic leaders, or political leaders who we will hold accountable for a lot of the legislation that they might have. So we will have those types of interviews too. We'll have faith leaders as guests, we'll have civic leaders as guests, but the person who's walking down the street, who has a challenge that they face, because they don't know how they're gonna put food on the table, they don't know how they're gonna send their kids to school tomorrow. Those all will also be the guests because they too have a voice.
Yeah. Well, you know, I think this kind of raises the question about how we think about the discussions about liberating our community. And when I say liberating our community, I mean both reflecting, as I said before, on our resilience and what has gotten us to where we are today, and what will propel us into the success that we want to see tomorrow. And so part of that opportunity is reflecting on some really core values that I think the Black Dispatch wants to lift up, the core value of history and understanding where we've been. And that, I think, going to be a really important part in trying to leave little tidbits as we have conversations with our guests, and kind of opening up our conversations with little quotes and other kinds of things that reflect on that history, that these conversations are not new conversations. They're iterative conversations that demand some response. And, you know, looking at that in the context of both our kind of dialogues and the kinds of actions that we're hoping those dialogues precipitate will be so important. And so I think there's going to be a lot of interesting artifacts that I'm hoping we leave as motivators, if you will, for future conversation and action as the Black Dispatch unfolds in its episodes.
There's one exciting episode that I know, it's around criminal justice reform. Every day, you know, we listen to the news, and too many of our residents are in pain. Pain either because they've been subjected to, you know, some violence, or the fact that, you know, they don't know how they're going to put food on the table. I know that one guest that I would love to have, I'm going to name him, but I'm going to just talk about the book that he wrote, because the substance of this book speaks so much to where we find ourselves. And I'm just going to hold this up, that any of you who feel like reading, there's a book that's just phenomenal. It's called Just Mercy by a brother. His name is Brian Stevenson. That's just doing phenomenal work and has done phenomenal work. And has done phenomenal work that I would like you to talk about, because there's this context in which we always have to set the conversations that we're having, the history in which, where have we been and where are we now, type of thing, if you can speak to that.
Yeah, well, so, I think, the criminal justice issues are replete in American history, and, mass incarceration and even the conversation that got set by Michelle Alexander, the new Jim Crow, all of that kind of manifests our understanding of the paradox that we keep talking about, and how America doesn't live up to its promise for democracy, fairness, and justice, and how it's manifest in its systems, criminal justice system being one. And one of the things that I want to point out is that the Illinois Black Caucus is doing some really important work around systems reform. And one area of is criminal justice reform, which we're going to be talking about, along with some other areas. They've got 4 pillars in which they're doing reforms around criminal justice, economic development, health, and human services, and education. And so, I mean, and why I'm so impressed about the work that they've done in this area, because it's a collection of legislative initiatives that are trying to deal with some of the historic and systemic issues that have been kind of embedded in these domains. And so we're going to have some conversations about that, those 4 pillars, and talk with some of the leaders that led those 4 pillars. In fact, that'll probably be some of our early work on the Black Dispatch in terms of lifting up those conversations. So I think that'll be really helpful to the communities, and not only lifting up those ideas about what they're trying to do, but also engage the community, because you can have legislation, but without communities being organized around that legislation that's being passed and holding folks who are responsible for its implementation, you can have legislation on the books that never really gets actualized, and that's something we don't want to happen. And so we're hoping to contribute to lifting up that opportunity to get those pillars activated, community understanding them, and making sure accountabilities or structures are in place for their implementation.
And I think that we can just share with our listeners and viewers that the leadership of the Illinois Black Caucus have been kind enough to work with us in terms of digging deeper, in terms of understanding what this legislation means and its impact on a multitude of stakeholders. So we will be interviewing not only those leaders, but the people who are most impacted by some of this legislation.
Absolutely.
Yeah.
Absolutely.
So we're looking forward to that, and if we were to just put together a calendar, we already have weeks and weeks of content around that. And I'm just going to repeat in terms of, there's criminal justice reform, violence reduction, and police accountability. The second pillar is education and workforce development. Economic access and equity and opportunity is the third pillar. And the fourth one is healthcare and human services. So we are excited about working with the leadership of the Illinois Black Caucus on being able to lift this up on behalf of them, but ask questions in the community in terms of how much do you understand this, and what might be the gaps between what the legislation is doing and where you are in terms of
and what you
struggle.
need, and what you need
In terms of your struggle and what you need.
Exactly. And I want to be also lift up the idea that while we're leading around the episodes leading with this conversation about the pillars, there's a whole series of things that we want to discuss. We want to discuss things from planning in the Black community and what does it mean for Black planners and people not who aren't trained necessarily as planners, but are actually doing planning and community building, and having them as a part of the dialogue about strategies and approaches, talking about fatherhood and family strengthening, issues that are so critical to the ultimate outcomes in our communities. Because if you don't have strong families, if you don't have families functioning in ways that can be self-sustaining, then communities can't be self-sustaining. Talking about kind of the barber talk, the barbershop talk, and the salon talk. What's going on in there? What's the views that are emerging there that we should be paying attention to? I think these are really fundamental areas that we hope to lift up and really kind of encourage and embrace the community and in our discussions.
Yeah. I think that the barbershop talk and the salon conversations are going to be exciting. Why? Because in our professional practice, one of the things that we do is that we go out into the community and say to the community, in order for us to strengthen the community, we have to listen. Why? Because you, as residents of the community, know best.
Yeah, you do have the answers.
And in having those answers, we want to listen. So the conversations in the barbershop, I can imagine, and you know what happens in the barbershop.
Yes, I do.
A whole lot of conversations go on, and we would love to be able to tap into those conversations and ask the question, what's the key question that you would like to ask of others who have a responsibility in helping to strengthen the community in which you live?
Yeah. Well, you know, and I think, you know, the Black Dispatch, TBD, to be discussed, has so much to offer in also introducing for us new topics that we may want to cover. That is to say, as we engage guests, stakeholders across various domains, we're going to be learning things, and we will be open to those new learnings and new explorations where, and we want to ask the hard questions. You know, all the questions are not going to be easy, and they're not going to always be answered, but we're going to try to kind of lift up, so just beyond discussion, lift up what we can do to address what it is we're discussing. So I think that's the key.
How do you connect with us? We've put in place a website, and we're going to be connecting on social media, because today how people communicate might be different than when we were younger.
You know that's right, bro. That's right.
And you know, it's going to be a situation where we want to reach people where they are. So if you communicate through Instagram, YouTube, Twitter, or Facebook, or if you just go to a website, you know, we have it there too. So it's all about the Black Dispatch,
right.
And we want you to be part of the conversation, because I think that we are all in this struggle together.
Yes, we are, brother. And I'm glad I'm struggling with you, black man.
Every day.
Right. All right.
Every
So we're looking forward to the audience participation. We're looking forward to your ideas and to your conversations, and we want you to be with us because we need you.
So now, can you give me another type of close, or
Sure.
Mhm.
Sure.
you said I'm Hubert, blah blah blah. You said I'm blah
Okay.
blah.
Just close it out like that.
You know, one
Yeah,
of those, you know,
okay.
like a network kind of close.
Okay. Okay.
Because I'm gonna have a little music at the last 30 seconds.
Okay. Okay.
While you talking, closing it out.
So, Kirk, it was a pleasure.
It was a pleasure, my brother.
Yeah.
It was a pleasure. Actually.
And we will be coming at you often. This is Hubert Morgan with the Black Dispatch.
And this is Kirk Harris, aka Dr. Kirk Harris, with the Black Dispatch. See you later.
Now, just kind of seem like y'all talking to each other a little bit. You know, I'm gonna have stuff music playing, you know, all that kind of stuff. And bring the book up, you know, the book, one of the books.
Do you want me to get this as well on this one?
Yeah. And so it's gonna be fading out at this point. We might have little credits rolling right here or something.
Okay,
While y'all doing that.
okay.
Yeah. Okay.
To-
Cut. That's it. Beautiful. Got it.
Alright.
With